The hum of conversation. Yet, among the usual chaos of the day, there is something strikingly different about this place, something that goes unnoticed by many but feels palpable to those who observe carefully. At the counter, a cashier stands, her gaze steady, her movements practiced, yet there's a quiet resilience in the way she carries herself. This is Sarah, a former soldier, and though she is now far removed from the battlefield, some of the scars of her past still linger. She lost a leg while serving in the military, a sacrifice that echoes in the faint clicking of her prosthetic leg as she walks. Yet Sarah, with her steel-gray eyes and unbreakable spirit, greets each customer with a smile that hides the weight of her experiences. Welcome to Heartfelt Gratitude Stories, where compassion and kindness weave tales that touch the soul. Ready to dive into what really happened? Let's go. Picture this: the store was a typical retail environment, filled with the constant sounds of cash registers, overhead announcements, and the rustling of shopping bags. On this particular day, the aisles were filled with customers, each preoccupied with their shopping, their conversations flowing around Sarah like background noise. She stood behind the counter, her eyes scanning the items in front of her, the repetitive motions of her work calming her. Each beep of the scanner was a small reminder that she was still standing, still here, still part of this world, even if it sometimes felt like she didn't belong. Sarah's prosthetic leg clicked softly as she moved, a sound she had become accustomed to over the years. The leg, though an incredible technological achievement, still felt like a constant reminder of everything she had lost. It was a stark contrast to the rest of her uniform, neatly pressed shirt, tidy apron, and a smile that she wore like a mask, hiding the pain and the memories of her time in service. But for Sarah, the smile wasn't just an attempt to mask the sadness, it had become a shield, one she had perfected over years of facing challenges no one could truly understand. She had learned how to smile through the pain, to endure the glances, the whispers, the stares, how to keep moving forward, even when it felt like the world wanted to knock her down. As Sarah reached out to bag another customer's groceries, the door to the store swung open with a jingle, and in walked a group of young men. Their voices were loud, their energy infectious. They were exactly the type of crowd you'd expect to see on a Saturday afternoon, free-spirited, brimming with bravado, and clearly enjoying their time out. But as they made their way past the aisles, their energy shifted when one of them spotted Sarah. The others followed his gaze, and just like that, their excitement turned into something else, something less innocent, more mocking. One of the young men, the loudest of the group, let out a laugh that rang through the store. It wasn't a warm, friendly laugh, it was the kind of laugh that carried a bite, a sharpness that cut through the atmosphere like a knife. Sarah didn't need to look up to know what was happening. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense the judgment in the air. It was a familiar feeling, one she had experienced countless times before. "Hey, you," the young man called, his voice echoing across the store. His friends paused, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and amusement, waiting for whatever comment was about to come next. Sarah forced herself to continue scanning the items on the counter, her heart racing in her chest. She could already feel the heat rising to her face, her skin prickling as if they could see right through her, see the wounds she had worked so hard to bury. "Your leg, how's that even work? Must be pretty heavy, huh? Bet you don't get far with that thing," he continued, his words loud enough for the entire store to hear. There was no kindness in his tone, no curiosity, just pure mockery. The others joined in, laughing loudly, as if the entire situation were some sort of joke. Sarah's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, but then she continued her work, focusing on the task at hand. She had learned to ignore the comments, the stares, the whispers that followed her wherever she went. It was easier this way. Easier to just tune them out and pretend they didn't matter. She had to. If she let every comment get to her, if she allowed the weight of their words to crush her, she wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. She wouldn't be able to face the world. But the words stung, as they always did. They always managed to find a way to hurt her, to remind her of everything she had lost. It wasn't the prosthetic leg itself that bothered her, it was the fact that every time someone saw it, they saw her as something less than whole, something different. They didn't see the soldier, the person who had fought for their country, for her beliefs. They saw the woman with the broken leg. Must be tough walking around like that, huh? How do you even do your job? Another young man chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension. Yeah, the first man added, smirking. I don't know how you don't just quit and go home. I'd be so embarrassed if I were you. Their laughter filled the space, louder now, as though they were feeding off each other's cruelty, pushing each other further into the realm of disrespect. Sarah's chest tightened. She could feel her face burning with shame, but she refused to let them see it. She refused to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had hurt her. She clenched her fists under the counter, willing herself to stay calm, to keep her composure. This was just another day, another moment to survive. Her fingers trembled slightly as she finished packing their items, handing them the receipt without saying a word. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, but the words felt thick in her throat. Have a nice day, she said, her smile still plastered on her face, even though it felt like the last thing she wanted to do. She wanted to tell them off, wanted to lash out and make them feel the pain they had caused. But she knew better. She had learned long ago that showing emotion in moments like these only made things worse. They would only see her as weak, as someone they could push around. But as the young men turned and began to walk away, their voices still carrying their cruel remarks, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. The way they had mocked her, so casually, so dismissively, it was a reminder that no matter how hard she tried, she would never truly be like everyone else. She would always be different. And no matter how many smiles she wore, no matter how many customers she served with politeness and grace, there would always be someone ready to remind her of her place in this world. She glanced up for a moment, watching the group of young men leave the store. She knew they would forget about her the moment they stepped out of the door. They would go on with their day, laughing, enjoying their youth and their freedom. But for Sarah, their words would linger long after they had gone, echoing in the quiet corners of her mind. As the door swung closed behind them, Sarah's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel the weight of their words. It was just for a moment, just a brief second, but it was enough to make her heart ache. She wanted so much to be seen, to be acknowledged for more than just the leg she had lost, for the strength it had taken to survive the battles, both in the field and out. But here, in this store, she was nothing more than the woman with the prosthetic leg. And no matter how hard she worked to prove herself, to show that she was still the same person inside, it felt like no one cared. But she wasn't going to let this moment define her. Not today. Not ever. As Sarah stood there, her hands still gripping the edges of the counter, her mind began to replay the insults over and over, like an uninvited guest that wouldn't leave. The young men's words echoed in her mind, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. She tried to focus on her next customer, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress, but the sting of their laughter lingered in her chest, heavier than the weight of her prosthetic leg. She could feel the temperature in the store change, the air thickening with discomfort. The harsh words from the group of young men had created a ripple in the store's otherwise calm atmosphere. Sarah's gaze flickered around the room, noting how the other customers, who were once so absorbed in their own worlds, now seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't just her that noticed what happened. There was an undeniable shift in the energy of the space, but no one spoke up. No one came to her defense. It was the same every time, she'd face the ridicule, the mockery, and the stares, and the silence from others would be deafening. She was used to the awkwardness, the discomfort that spread in the air when people didn't know how to react to her. Some pretended not to notice her leg at all, as if they feared acknowledging it would somehow make her feel different. Others, like the young men, couldn't resist making her the punchline of their jokes. But the silence that followed the cruelty, the silence of those who did nothing, always hit her hardest. She glanced at the woman in front of her again, but the customer was already focused on the total. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, and her fingers, as steady as they had been for years, now felt unsteady. The beep of the scanner no longer had its usual comfort. The transaction felt mechanical, hollow. Her eyes quickly darted to the end of the aisle where the young men had disappeared, their laughter fading as they made their way out of the store. They were gone, but the sting of their words remained, gnawing at her. It was always like this. The mocking, the hurtful comments, the feeling of being different, of being less. And despite her best efforts to brush it off, to keep it from seeping into her soul, it never fully disappeared. It never did. But then, just as she began to feel herself slip into that familiar, dark place, the place where the world's indifference seemed too much to bear, she felt something. A presence. It wasn't the usual humdrum of another customer walking by or a staff member going about their task. No, this was something else. The door to the store jingled softly, signaling that another customer had entered. Sarah didn't look up immediately, lost in the whirl of her thoughts. She simply heard the shuffle of feet, the soft rustle of someone approaching the counter. But then the sound stopped. She felt it, a shift in the atmosphere that was different from the usual bustle of customers. The man who stood before her was no one she recognized. He wasn't tall or imposing, but there was something about him that drew her in. Perhaps it was the way he moved, slow but deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world, despite the busy store around him. His weathered face was lined with years of experience, and his hands, calloused and rough, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. He wore a faded brown leather jacket, old but not worn out, and there was a quiet dignity in his every step. His eyes, though tired, were sharp, and they held something deep, something understanding, something Sarah couldn't quite place. She could feel the man's gaze even before he spoke. It was the kind of gaze that didn't judge, didn't shrink away from the pain it could see in others. It was the kind of gaze that recognized suffering and respected it. She felt it in the way he looked at her, like he saw her, really saw her, not as the woman with the prosthetic leg, not as someone to pity, but as a person worthy of respect, worthy of acknowledgement. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, yet it held an undeniable warmth. "You're a hero," he said, his words steady and deliberate, as if they were the only thing that truly mattered in that moment. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The words were simple, just 6 words. But to Sarah, they were a lifeline thrown into the swirling waters of her emotions. Her heart skipped a beat. It was as though the man's words cut through the thick fog of her self-doubt, piercing the veil of her insecurities. His voice was a quiet storm, a force of nature that didn't ask for recognition, didn't demand applause. It was a voice that spoke directly to her soul, offering a truth she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for a long time. She didn't know what to say at first. She couldn't speak. It wasn't just the power of his words, it was the sheer, unspoken empathy that filled the space between them. He didn't feel sorry for her. He didn't pity her. He simply recognized her for who she truly was. The tears welled up, though she fought to keep them at bay. Sarah swallowed hard, the knot in her throat threatening to choke her. She had always prided herself on her ability to hold it together, to keep the pain buried beneath a smile. But this man, this stranger, had seen right through the mask she wore. He had given her something more than sympathy. He had given her the one thing she had been longing for, validation. He had recognized the strength it took to stand there, to work through the pain, to face the world every day with a smile even when the weight of the world was on her shoulders. The moment lingered, and for once, Sarah didn't feel like the woman with the broken leg. She felt like Sarah. She felt like someone who had fought for everything she had, someone who deserved respect and acknowledgement, not just for her sacrifices, but for the person she was. The old man smiled softly, a smile that was full of understanding, and nodded once before turning to leave. He didn't need to say anything more. His 6 words had done all the talking. He had left her with something she had never expected to find in a place like this, peace. As he walked out of the store, Sarah's eyes followed him, still processing everything that had just transpired. She had expected nothing more than silence, then continued mockery. But in one moment, everything had changed. And with that change, something inside her shifted, something heavy she hadn't even realized was there. Her smile, which had been stiff moments before, softened. She stood a little straighter. The mockery, the ridicule, the pain, it didn't matter so much anymore. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt her heart lighten. She wasn't alone. And for the first time, she didn't have to fight for the validation she so desperately needed. It had been given freely, and it had come from the most unexpected place. As the elderly man stepped out of the store, the door chimed behind him, and for a long moment, the sound seemed to hang in the air, suspended between the now quiet space and the heavy thoughts Sarah was grappling with. The young men, whose laughter had once filled the store with mockery, had vanished, leaving only the sound of the store's hum in their wake. The atmosphere felt different now, heavier with meaning, quieter in the aftermath of something that had shifted, and it was all because of those 6 words, "You're a hero. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Sarah stood frozen for a few seconds, her hands still resting on the counter, her body tense, as if the old man's presence had imprinted something deep within her. Her heart beat loudly in her chest, but this time, the rhythm felt different. It wasn't the beat of someone who was burdened by ridicule and judgment. No, this was the heartbeat of someone who had been seen, really seen, for the first time in a long while. She blinked, wiping her eyes quickly. The tears that had been gathering were not ones of sorrow but of relief. It was as though a dam had broken, a flood of emotions pouring out that had been held back for so long. Sarah had been carrying this weight for years, the weight of her past, the weight of her disability, and the weight of the ridicule that had often followed her wherever she went. But for the first time, in that brief, fleeting moment, the weight felt lighter. The realization began to sink in, her prosthetic leg didn't define her. It was a part of her, yes, but it wasn't who she was. And the way the world had often treated her because of it, well, that wasn't her fault either. It was the fault of people who couldn't see past appearances, people who judged too quickly, who didn't take the time to understand. As Sarah glanced around the store, her gaze landed on the people still moving through the aisles, unaware of the small victory that had just been won. The store was still bustling with activity, but it no longer felt as oppressive. The words of the elderly man echoed in her mind, their power growing stronger with each passing second. She realized she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Not anymore. But just as the thoughts of relief began to sink in, Sarah's attention was drawn back to the checkout counter, where a few customers had gathered in line. They were looking at her, some hesitantly, others with a softness she hadn't expected. She hadn't noticed it before, but now that the air had cleared, it was impossible to ignore. It was as if the room had collectively shifted. The people who had previously looked past her, who had been too absorbed in their own lives to really see her, were now paying attention. A woman in her late 30s, dressed in a business suit, stepped forward first. She was holding a shopping basket, her face a mix of uncertainty and recognition. Her eyes met Sarah's, and for a brief moment, Sarah could see something shift in the woman's expression, guilt, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition of what had transpired in the store. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, her voice gentle. "I just wanted to say. I'm really sorry for what they said to you." Her words were sincere, her eyes apologetic. Sarah blinked, surprised by the sudden attention, but before she could respond, another customer, an older man with a graying beard, stepped forward as well. "That was uncalled for," the man added, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't even hear it at first, but I saw how they were looking at you. No one should have to go through that. You're strong, don't let people make you feel lesser." His tone was warm, and Sarah couldn't help but feel the truth in his words. He wasn't just apologizing for what had happened, he was offering her something deeper, he was acknowledging her strength. And then, a third person, a young woman with short, curly hair, added her voice to the chorus. "I've been through stuff like that, and it's hard," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But you should know, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You're amazing just as you are." For a moment, Sarah stood there, her breath catching in her throat as the reality of the situation hit her. She had spent so many years in silence, carrying the burden of other people's ignorance and cruelty, trying to show them she was more than her prosthetic leg. But here, in this moment, something had changed. She wasn't just seen as a person with a disability. She was seen as a person, period. She wasn't broken. She wasn't less than. She was whole. The store, which moments ago had felt so isolating, now seemed filled with a sense of camaraderie, of shared understanding. She realized it wasn't just the apology that mattered. It was the recognition, the acknowledgement of her worth. For so long, she had wished for someone to recognize her for the person she was, not just the woman with a prosthetic leg. And now, that recognition was coming in droves. Sarah cleared her throat, finally finding her voice after what felt like an eternity of silence. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words catching in her throat. She wasn't sure what else to say, but the sincerity of her gratitude rang true. "I really appreciate that. It means a lot." The customers who had spoken to her nodded, their eyes filled with kindness. The woman in the business suit smiled warmly, her hand resting briefly on Sarah's shoulder in a silent gesture of support. As the small group began to disperse, Sarah's heart felt fuller than it had in a long time. There had been so much silence in her life, so much judgment and mockery. But today, in this moment, something had shifted, not just in her but in those around her as well. People who had once looked past her now saw her for who she truly was, a person deserving of respect, kindness, and dignity. As the last customer left the counter and Sarah prepared to resume her duties, she couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a forced smile. It wasn't the mask she'd worn for years. No, this was a smile of someone who had been seen, heard, and recognized. And it was all because of the simple, powerful words of a stranger who had stepped into her life at exactly the right moment. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt at peace. She wasn't just the cashier with the prosthetic leg. She was Sarah, the woman who had fought for her life, the woman who had endured, and the woman who was finally beginning to believe she was more than enough. Sarah stood at the counter, her hands now still, her fingers lightly resting on the cold surface. The moment the elderly man left the store, a quiet weight settled over her. The shift in the atmosphere felt palpable, like something had cracked open inside her and let a rush of warmth flood in. For the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to breathe, really breathe, without feeling the constant pressure of judgment weighing on her chest. She looked down at the transaction she had just completed, but her mind wasn't there anymore. It was somewhere else, somewhere that was slowly starting to feel a little brighter. Her gaze drifted around the store, catching fleeting glimpses of the customers who had been witnessing the scene, some of them still lingering near the aisles, others lost in their own worlds. The soft murmur of voices filled the air, but there was something different in the way people were moving now, as though the energy in the room had subtly shifted. Her heart beat a little easier now, the tightness that had once gripped her chest slowly loosening. It was amazing how just one small interaction, one brief exchange of words, could shift an entire day. She had been dreading the thought of returning to her work, of facing the world again after the cruel mockery she had endured, but now it felt different. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her from her reverie. Sarah looked up and saw an older woman walking toward her, a customer she had seen around the store before. The woman was smiling warmly, a gentle but sincere expression on her face. She didn't look like she was in a hurry, as if she'd taken the time to come over for more than just the usual pleasantries. "Hey there," the woman said softly, her voice calm and understanding. "I just wanted to say something." Sarah blinked, slightly taken aback by the kindness in the woman's tone. "Oh, sure. What's up?" The woman smiled again, her eyes reflecting a kind of recognition that made Sarah feel strangely seen. "I noticed what happened earlier," she began, her voice quiet enough so that it felt like a private conversation, despite being in the middle of a busy store. "And I just wanted you to know. I don't know what they were thinking, but you're stronger than they'll ever understand." The words sank into Sarah's chest, and for a moment, she had to swallow back the lump in her throat. There was no pity in the woman's voice, no judgment, just simple, raw truth. Sarah had always thought that strength was something you had to prove to others, but now, as she stood here, it occurred to her that the strength she had to prove wasn't for anyone else, it was for herself. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small, neatly folded card. "I've been where you are," she said, her voice steady. "I've had people mock me for things that weren't even my fault, and I know it hurts. But you," she paused, looking Sarah in the eyes, "you don't need anyone's approval. You're more than enough just as you are." She handed the card to Sarah, her eyes soft with understanding. "Keep this. Whenever you need a reminder, just read it. You're not alone in this." Sarah took the card from the woman's hand, a sense of gratitude flooding her. It wasn't just the kindness of the gesture, but the way the woman had spoken, as though Sarah's pain had been witnessed, understood, and honored. The tears she had been holding back threatened to fall again, but this time, they weren't tears of frustration or sadness, they were tears of relief. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her voice thick. "I didn't expect that." The woman gave her a gentle nod and turned to leave, but before she did, she looked back over her shoulder. "You've got this," she said, and Sarah could feel the weight of those words settle in her heart like a promise. As the woman walked away, Sarah stood there for a moment, holding the card in her hands. She didn't even need to open it to know that it was a message she'd treasure. In that brief exchange, she had been given something invaluable, something she hadn't realized she needed until now, not just validation, but the recognition of her worth by someone who truly understood. For the first time, Sarah didn't feel invisible. She felt like she mattered. The world outside the store may still be filled with harsh words and judgment, but Sarah knew that, no matter what, she could handle it. She could face the mockery, the stares, and the quiet indifference because now, for once, she didn't feel alone. She was part of a greater story, a story of resilience, of courage, of strength in the face of adversity. And she would carry that strength with her, not just in the form of a prosthetic leg, but in her heart, where it truly mattered. The atmosphere in the store seemed to change in a way Sarah couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just the lingering warmth of the elderly woman's words, it was as if a ripple had gone through the crowd, a subtle shift in how people saw her. As she returned to her duties, scanning items for customers, she noticed more smiles directed at her than she had in the entire time she'd worked there. The usual avoidance, the uncomfortable looks, the silence, those were now replaced with nods of acknowledgement and gestures of support. It was as though the store had collectively woken up to something they had all been blind to before. Sarah worked quickly, her movements more fluid than before, her mind still processing everything that had happened. The young men who had mocked her were long gone, and with them, their ridicule faded into the background of her memory. Instead, the faces of the people who had shown her kindness and understanding filled her thoughts, giving her a sense of peace she hadn't expected. And then, the unexpected happened. Just as she was finishing up with a customer, the door to the store jingled again, and this time, it wasn't a typical shopper. It was the elderly man who had spoken to her earlier, the one who had told her she was a hero. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she looked up and saw him walking toward her, his gait slow but purposeful, just as it had been before. But this time, something was different. His demeanor was calm, but there was an air of pride about him now, as if he knew exactly the impact he had made on her, and perhaps even on the entire store. He walked toward her with the same quiet grace, but this time, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of reverence for him. The old man didn't go to the checkout counter this time. Instead, he walked past it, stopping just short of Sarah, his eyes meeting hers once again. "You know," he said, his voice as steady as it had been before, "I've been thinking about you all day." Sarah blinked, surprised by the unexpected remark. She hadn't expected him to return, let alone to find her still thinking about their brief exchange. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, offering him a soft smile, the kind of smile that was no longer a mask but an expression of genuine appreciation. "I meant what I said earlier," he continued, his voice quiet but full of conviction. You're a hero, and no one can take that away from you. Not those boys, not anyone. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as his words washed over her once more. She was trying to keep it together, trying not to let the emotions overwhelm her, but his reassurance was more than she could bear. For so long, she had questioned her worth. She had doubted herself, held back in fear of how the world would perceive her. But here was a man, a stranger, telling her that her worth wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion. And that thought, though simple, felt like the strongest kind of validation. You know, Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but strong, I've spent so much time hiding from this, trying to make people see me as normal, as just like everyone else. But maybe, just maybe, I'm allowed to be more than that. I'm allowed to be me. The elderly man nodded, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. Exactly, he said, his voice like a gentle affirmation. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've already shown what you're made of. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest like a truth she had known all along but had never been able to fully embrace. Thank you, she said softly. For saying that. It's been a long time since I felt like I mattered. The old man simply smiled, his eyes gleaming with warmth. Well, you do. And you always will. You just need to believe it yourself. And with that, he turned and made his way toward the door once more, his slow but steady steps echoing as he left the store. Sarah stood there, watching him go, her heart full. It wasn't just his words that had left an impression on her, it was the way he had made her feel. He had given her something more than encouragement. He had given her the gift of seeing herself through someone else's eyes, someone who saw her as the hero she had always been, even if the world had been too quick to overlook it. As the door closed behind him, Sarah felt something inside her shift. For the first time, she felt whole, not because she had been validated by others, but because she had begun to validate herself. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about standing tall in her own truth, regardless of the opinions or judgments of those around her. The store continued its rhythm, the customers moved in and out, and life went on, but Sarah stood there for a moment longer, taking it all in. She wasn't just the cashier with the prosthetic leg anymore. She was Sarah, the woman who had faced her demons, who had fought for what she believed in, and who had finally found the strength to embrace her story. And that, she realized, was all she needed. Around her, the mood in the store has transformed. Customers begin to approach her, each offering a kind word, an apology, or a simple gesture of support. One by one, they come forward, acknowledging her with genuine respect. Thank you for your service, one says. You're amazing, another adds. And in that moment, Sarah realizes something she's never fully understood until now, she's not alone. She takes a deep breath, feeling a sense of pride she hasn't felt in years. The old man has given her more than just words, he's given her the courage to stand tall in the face of adversity. And for the first time in a long while, she feels like she's truly been seen. As Sarah watches the crowd around her, she smiles softly to herself. The emotional weight that had burdened her for so long feels lighter now, not because the mocking voices have stopped, but because she knows her worth. The journey to reclaiming that self-worth may have been long and painful, but it was worth every step. Sarah's story hit me like a punch to the gut, exposing the raw ugliness of how we treat those who don't fit society's mold. It's infuriating, those young men mocking her prosthetic leg, reducing her to a punchline, when she's a damn hero who's faced more than they'll ever comprehend. Their cruelty isn't just ignorance, it's a symptom of a world too quick to judge and too slow to care. But what truly broke me was the elderly man's words, "You're a hero." That simple kindness shattered the isolation Sarah endured, and it wrecked me with hope. I'm in awe of her resilience, standing tall despite the stares, the whispers, the casual venom. It makes me furious that she has to fight for dignity daily, yet it ignites a fire in me to do better, to be the stranger who lifts someone up instead of tearing them down. This isn't just about disability, it's about humanity. We need more empathy, more courage to see people for who they are, not what they've lost. Sarah's journey from shame to strength isn't just inspiring, it's a desperate call to wake up and treat each other with the respect we all deserve. Subscribe to Heartfelt Gratitude Stories, we bring you tales like this every week. Thank you for being here.